Today, the war for talent is fierce, and companies that strive to find the best talent also want to retain the best talent. So that's why we've asked John Smith, Director of SMB Solutions with Global Business Applications at Quisitive and Imperform, to join us. John works with senior management to ensure that talent management solutions fit both their short and their long-term needs. His career spans both strategic human resources and finance, including 2 decades of consulting experience, both domestic and international. John, welcome to the Voices of HR.
Thanks, Bert. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me today.
Absolutely. So today, HR has really been put in the hot seat. They've been asked to hire the best talent. They've been asked to check the box on diversity. They've been asked to check the box on the best packages for benefits. As companies are becoming, what I would say, more in tune with these employment shifts that are occurring really across the globe. And if you want to hire and retain the best talent, you absolutely must be competitive. But the one complaint that I see and I hear over and over again in both research and in one-on-ones respectively, really from the true high performers, is that my company doesn't value me. I've got a boss that doesn't value me. I'm not being valued for what I bring to the table. In fact, I read an HBR article the other day that stated that 1 in 6 identified high potentials will actually become high performers in the future. So companies seem to be misfiring when it comes to talent identification, valuation, and retention. So it begs the question, are they misfiring with performance management, and why?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting take, right? And I think one of the things that we see a lot of, we've been in this performance management space for 20 years. And when clients come to us with processes that they want to put in place or that they're trying to improve, it gives us a viewpoint. It gives us a viewpoint across all kinds of different organizations, organizational sizes, and industries. And I think it is a struggle, right? And at the heart of it, I think there isn't necessarily a correct way to do performance management. There isn't a guidebook that says, this is how you should do it to ensure success. And because of that, people have had very bad experiences with performance management, and it colors what they want to do with it going forward. It's they want to walk around the pool and wait for it to be the right temperature. They're going to dip their toe in it, but they're not going to dive in until they absolutely believe that it's something that is really going to work. And as a result of that, we end up with, as you said, right, we end up with high potential employees or high performers saying, I'm not getting the feedback I need, right? My manager doesn't value me. And at the heart of that is to say, okay, to some degree, we would look to our performance management process to figure that out. Certainly one of the biggest things and one of the biggest trends that we're seeing, and something that's changed so much over the last 20 years, is the focus on continuous feedback and how we structure feedback, mentorship and guidance, because employees want feedback. And so we need a modern performance management process to do that. And a lot of organizations, big and small, struggle with it, no question.
Absolutely. And we're going to come back to feedback. But what other trends, as you sit in this incredible seat that you're in, when you talk to senior leadership, when you look at these variety of companies across all of these different industries, what are other trends that you're seeing as well?
Well, I think one of the bigger ones right now, because there's so much literature out there on big organizations, making big changes in performance. We're seeing a trend where performance management systems become very specialized and very focused on the company or the organization and what their goals and objectives are. So long gone are the days where you say, hey, our performance appraisal or our performance management process is based on an appraisal, with a 5-point rating scale and goals and objectives and competencies. That world's kind of leaving us behind, and we're getting really much more focused. And so, I think designing programs to suit organizational needs is certainly a big trend. The biggest one by far is the interest, as we said, in the frequency of coaching and feedback and one-on-one check-ins, institutionalizing those into the process. And then I think the other one we're seeing a lot of focus on is how can we drive outcomes from this process? Of course, one of the important outcomes is employee engagement. There's no question about that. But the other outcomes are equally important: compensation, rewards, promotion, succession decisions. How can we use that to get information? So, those trends are happening. It's no longer just a performance appraisal is performance management. It's a much bigger, more strategic focus on the whole program.
Because the workplace is changing.
Absolutely.
I mean, you're seeing the baby boomers roll off. You're seeing, this younger generation that are just now entering. They're incredibly diverse. I read the other day that, there's more women graduating college than men for the first time. There's more Black women graduating college than ever before in our country's history. So the makeup of the demographics are changing. And I suspect that is one of the tipping points or one of the inflection points that companies need to identify or have been identified in order to create the change that needs to happen for the future.
Yeah, no question. And if you think about the voice of the employee in this process, it's pretty unanimous. When sometimes go into organizations and we do kind of a current state assessment. And what's overwhelming is the employee's desire for feedback, and from multiple angles. There's the diversity angle. There's a younger generation coming into the workforce. Let's all talk about COVID and the movement in the workplace to virtual and working from home, and how much that has impacts. It has small impacts in ways too that you don't have a hallway conversation with your manager anymore because you're not in the hallway to talk to them. And the only feedback you get is when you're in a scripted virtual meeting with them, where it starts on the hour and ends hopefully 5 minutes before the end of the hour, so you get a break. So all of these things are coming together to really drive a focus around, hey, not only performance management, but how does it change and adjust and adapt and keep up with this? And I think the employee experience is one of the key ingredients right in the center of it for the reasons you mentioned, Berta.
And so how does an HR, we have a lot of listeners who are the only HR professional within their organization. We have Fortune 50 organizations listening. How do you help these organizations of all sizes identify when it's time? Is there any kind of trigger point or any specific feedback that you're seeing is consistent across all these industries and sizes that maybe give a hint to HR that it's time? Because it can be terrifying, I think, to change the performance management system. That's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work. And I can tell you that, we meet really, I'll classify them at a very high level, two types of clients in organizations, regardless of size. And we work with small organizations. We have lots of organizations we've worked with that are exactly what you described, with one person in HR who's got to shoulder the responsibility of everything, right? Including technology implementations, which they may not have signed up to.
True.
When they took on the role. These two types are, the first one is, I've got a real problem and I don't know how to solve it, right? I've got this performance management thing and all I know is everybody in our company hates it. It's not useful and I got to make it better. So that's camp one. Camp two usually is, I've worked with our management team. We have discussed this. This is a priority. And I have their engagement and support, so that we believe we want to improve this. And here are the reasons why. And I have a vision for that. Okay. In 3 years down the road, once the new process is in place, camp two always does better than camp one does. And meaning that having a vision for what you want to achieve is really important. Creating that vision, sharing that vision, and getting the buy-in from your management team is an absolutely critical first step. And though I can just tell you, those are the organizations that have continued success. If it is a single HR practitioner who wants to institute performance management and they don't have the buy-in from the rest of the team, of course we help them. We always will help them. But what happens down the line is they leave, or they get promoted, or they hand it off to someone else, and the performance management change they're trying to make dies because it was just on their plate. And so I think the biggest thing, no matter what organizational size there is, it has to be bigger than one person. It has to have buy-in from the management team. It has to have top-down support. And it sounds cliche to say top-down support, but it really does, because this process impacts the process change you're going to make impacts every single employee in the organization. And we rely on managers to support it and promote it, to help the process change. So I think a big part of that, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to get wrong in this process, and so you definitely want, to measure twice, cut once on this
Yeah,
one.
it's true, Berta. And we've over the years developed a little model, and it's a really simple model. It says, as organizations approach us, they're in one of three camps. There's actually 4 camps. The first camp is I don't have a performance management process and I want one. But really the first camp, after that, if you have one in place, the 3 camps are, hey, I've got an annual appraisal process, and we look at a document and once a year and we force managers to have a discussion, and maybe we do something as a gate to making a compensation or merit adjustment with that. Second camp says, well, I want to be more modern. I don't want to just look in the rearview mirror at what's behind us. I want to have a conversation with the employee about what their goals and aspirations are. I want to do some check-ins during the year. I want to, support continuous feedback. And then the third camp we see clients in is the more radical camps that get a lot of press. People like Harvard Business Review write great articles about these organizations that are making huge wholesale changes to their processes to say, we're not doing ratings. We're not doing an annual appraisal. We're just going to do quarterly check-ins, and we're going to let the employee and manager together guide the performance and use it as a tool to guide the process. And what we often find when we're talking to clients is we say ourselves, what camp are they in, and which one do they want to get to? Right? Are we somebody with an annual appraisal? They're going to hop all the way over to no appraisal at all and no ratings? Probably not. Most organizations we deal with say, we have an annual appraisal form. It's terrible. We want it to be something better than that. And they're trying to become more modern. They're trying to institute check-ins, at least conversations, more than once a year. And that's a big trend, and that's a big part of what we see. So we have we ran with some of the HR conferences, we do this presentation called Reviving the Performance Review, and it's all about that. I got a lot of really good feedback about it, which was nice. So
I love the term reviving,
yeah,
because it is kind of dead. Yeah, the old world is dead, and it's not going to accomplish what it was intended to do 20, 30 years ago when it was put in place. One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, because you sit in the C-suite with these executives and with HR. And one of the things that I truly, truly believe in, having sat in those seats and watched some of this play out, is that a lot of, most organizations, the C-suite gets together, they create their strategic plan, they put their plan together for the next 3 to 5 years. Sometimes if it's a very large organization, they'll have a plan that reaches out, 10 to 15, sometimes 20 years if they have a really good fundamental strategy in their organization. And if there's small tweaks to the strategy and they forget that the people are the ones who are going to implement it, those are the companies that I think have the most difficulty because they aren't thinking about execution. So one thing we talked about before was you really encourage HR and organizations when they think about performance management to think strategically, but execute flawlessly. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think on the execution side, it starts with having realistic plans, right? So when we talk to an HR team about implementing a new performance management process or making big changes to a performance management process, we usually start at the top, which is there's a temptation to boil the ocean. There's a temptation to throw away everything we've done because we in a room have sat here and agreed that just starting a wholesale new process is the best way to do it. Typically, we found that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Typically, we found that the employees and managers in the organization that need to follow have trouble doing that. And so I think small tweaks are an important element to it. But to come back to it, I think the biggest thing is having the buy-in from the top, the management team, having that vision and support and saying, let's start with that, because if we have a vision, then we can create a plan to execute against the vision. And in there, with the boil the ocean concept, is creating short-term and long-term goals. So for instance, a short-term goal as it relates to improving a performance management process could be, we're going to institute a recommended quarterly check-in. And that's the big change we're going to make. It doesn't mean changing rating scales and throwing away content and competencies and redefining the whole objective structure. It means making a small change. And it may say, we're going to do that for the next 2 years and we're going to see how that goes. And after 2 years, we're going to make an assessment of, is the big annual review at the end of the year still important in its current form? And 2 years from now, once we've done our quarterly check-ins, we're going to assess if we're getting buy-in. We're going to assess if that's moving the performance curve forward. And then we're going to make that decision. And so I think having short-term and long-term objectives that are agreed to are really a good way to frame execution, because if we ask employees, I often ask employees and managers to set short-term and long-term objectives. There's a reason, because we're developing an execution plan to meet those, right? So to me, it's kind of similar when we're rolling out a new process to say, let's have the guideposts and let's develop a plan to execute against those. And oftentimes that resonates really well. We do talk to a lot of executives and we sit in meetings talking to them about changing the process and what they should do. And most are very receptive to that message of short and long-term plans.
Sure. So you had, I believe it was a hospital with
That's right.
more than, I think, 2,000 employees. And you had conversations about their performance management. Can you talk a little bit about how that conversation went, whatever you can share?
Yeah, absolutely.
What was the starting point and kind of what happened in the middle and what were the results?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, and it is a hospital, and it had more than 2,000 employees, and they were in a process that was probably a 30-year-old process. It actually involved a piece of paper being filled out once a year with a few check boxes on it. And that determined, it was an overall rating, and it determined what your merit increase would be for the following year. And it was kind of like, hey, meets expectations, you get 3%, exceeds expectations, you get 3.5%, and outstanding, you get 4%. And the percent would change every year. And they came to us saying, we want to retool our performance management process because we don't think anybody's getting value out of it. And we went in and had meetings, and of course, it became apparent that it was really being used, this process was being used simply as a gate to compensation, that it was, that's all it was.
The pay for performance?
In a way, yeah, right.
Yeah.
And although I would argue that, yeah, I guess it's pay for performance. I don't know in that setting, in a healthcare setting, how much the performance actually really meant in terms of your pay, because I think it was really pre-established. But I would say that the desire was, we're getting a lot of complaints that we don't have a performance management process. And we looked at it and said, yeah, it looks that way to us as well. And I think one of the biggest recommendations we made was to split the performance management process from the compensation process. And that created, surprisingly, a lot of discussion, because I was surprised. I thought everybody was reading this and there's nothing new in a concept of splitting performance and comp. And it wasn't to split the process. It was to decouple the conversation. It was to say, let's really focus on a performance conversation. And that meant that the performance reviews were happening on an anniversary basis. The compensation process was happening once a year. And so if we were going to split them, how could somebody who, is in an August cycle, how could their performance assessment from August, how could that work when we do our compensation process in January? Like, John, that's broken. That's never going to work. And we had to explain to them that, in fact, it does work. You can read performance reviews from the last 12 months. You have a system there to provide information to you. And the important part more was to say to the employee that when we're sitting down to talk about performance, we're actually not talking about compensation. Performance will be a feeder into compensation. It's one of the feeders into compensation. But let's really focus the discussion on performance. And so by doing that, that also allowed us then to say in a large organization and to market in a large organization to the employees this change. We're going to institute at least a mid-year check-in. We're going to put in place a process where everybody actually has a direct manager. We had an example in that hospital of a nurse manager who had management responsibilities for 120 employees. So
By
my question,
herself?
yeah, and exactly, Perna.
120 direct reports.
Yeah, and a once a
That's
year
a record.
process. And I said, well, how can you expect this person to do justice to performance? How
Right.
does she have time to have 120 meetings? It doesn't work. And so that also was part of saying, and part of breaking the process up, it was to say, let's not use focal date for performance. Let's move it to an anniversary date. Let's split up the once a year pain and spread it over 12 months for these large groups of managers with large groups of employees. And so the outcome was it was really well received. The outcome was employees no longer saw the performance discussion as simply a checkbox or a gate to get into what their merit was going to be. And in some cases, it could be the performance discussion, hopefully happening more than 9 months ago and on some frequency, but the last major appraisal could have been 9 months ago, informing your compensation for the next year. And it seems to be well received.
So help me pull that thread a little bit. So, as someone who for a long time came up in the generation of pay for performance, that conversation always happened in tandem together. This is the impact that you made to the organization. Here's your compensation, or here's your promotion, right? When you decouple those two things, how do you keep performance at a high level, at a high performer functioning? Not all high performers or outperformers are motivated by money or status, right?
Correct.
It's maybe an intrinsic thing. But a lot of people, of course, everybody works to live. And so how do you, if you decouple those two, how do you keep those high performers motivated? How do you keep the average performer motivated when it's not tied to compensation? Or is it tied to compensation? It's just not in the same conversation.
It is tied and it's not in the same conversation. But part of this conversation as well is looking at the compensation process. And if you think about the compensation process, what our clients tell me, and I think they generally know what they're talking about, is that compensation has three pillars. Market equity, internal equity, and performance are the three pillars of a successful compensation program. So performance on its own is one of the important pillars, and performance will always be a feeder into it. But compensation looks at other things as well. And so part of that is educating the high performer that it isn't just a direct link. It's not just one for one. That there are other factors at play when we as an organization look at merit, and we look at the budgets for merit, and we look at what we need to do. We look at promotion when we do that. So part of that is part of the conversation, but it is a decoupling. It's not a splitting. Performance, I think, will always inform compensation. And I think because of that, and because organizations employ large groups of people and pay them lots of money, performance management will always be something that is desired, talked about, and that management teams will want to improve.
I love that. It's a decoupling, not a splitting.
Exactly.
Big
Yeah,
delineation there.
absolutely.
Perfect. So let me get back to brass tacks. So,
Mhm.
asking a manager, maybe he has 120 people. Hopefully, she doesn't have that many anymore. Let's say you have 20 people, and you
Yeah.
need to now have these quarterly conversations. I get calls all the time because of conflict with bosses or conflict with the difference between how someone thinks they're performing and the value that they're actually bringing to the organization or the boss's perception of that value. So obviously there's a disconnect there. What kind of conversation is the best type of quarterly conversation that you can have with someone on your team to keep them motivated, to develop them, to keep them inspired, to hopefully engender loyalty to your organization? What does that conversation look like?
Usually three elements. And I'm going to tell your listeners, there is a great resource out there for a firm that everybody knows that does an amazing job at this. That's
Mhm.
Adobe. And Adobe instituted a quarterly check-in process in 2012. They have a dedicated web page to what they do, including employee and manager preparation guides for the quarterly conversation. But to answer your question, Berta, at the heart of it is three things, right? It's a conversation about goals and objectives, which no matter, it's very interesting in this world of everybody changing their performance review processes from GE to Microsoft to Adobe to Deloitte, and they all get a lot of press when they do it, given their size. That's important, and we can learn from them. But one of the things at the heart of their systems, they may change the name of it, they're all doing goals and objectives.
Mhm.
And so that conversation that's Adobe would say has been very successful, and certainly our clients would say it is a conversation about goals and objectives. It's a conversation about feedback, and it's a conversation about career planning.
Mm.
And if you think about that, two out of those three are forward-looking conversations, and one
Mhm.
is kind of in the rear view mirror a little bit, which is the feedback part.
Mhm.
Goals adjust and change and adapt, and we have to move them as we meet quarterly. We have feedback about what happened looking back over the last 3 months, but we continue to look forward with goals and objectives. And we ask the employee about how this is contributing to their development and what
Mm.
resources we as managers or as an organization can provide to them to help them achieve their objectives moving forward. And so again, I would come back to, nobody, I really haven't seen anyone do a better job with this, at least in terms of the preparation and material that's out there. I would encourage everyone, just Google
Mhm.
Adobe check-in process and check out what they have. It is a great resource if you're thinking of instituting quarterly reviews.
Well, I love this because when we spoke before, you talked about this philosophy of really starting where the individual's at and helping them to develop and impact the goals of the organization, not the goals really instituting to them or telling them what they need to do differently or maybe where they're not succeeding. So you started with the strengths of the individual and said, okay, how can we do this more so that you can make a bigger impact to the organization? And I think that is a critical difference in a successful conversation or a not successful conversation because it really is starting with the individual. And quite honestly, even with 2,000 employees, there are 2,000 individuals who are all coming together for a common goal.
Absolutely. And a lot of the successful processes out there, more and more we see this, right? At a very basic fundamental when we start a quarter or we start a year. And you look at where does the process start? More and more organizations start the process with the employee.
Mm,
And they say to the employee, they may say, here's a list of organizational objectives. Here's what we're trying to achieve as a team or a company.
mm,
How do you think you fit into this? And it starts with trying to drive accountability for objectives and planning at the employee first, which when you do the follow-up conversation of how things are going, it's much more logical if the person you're having the conversation with is the one who was involved in setting the objective in the first place. It
right,
drives a little more engagement, right? Whereas just top down saying that this is your goal for the year and this is what you're going to do,
right,
it's not going to work across the board. It
right.
has to have a level of employee participation to make it work.
And, by asking the employee, I think, I was just on the phone with a client before I walked in the room today, and we were talking about success and what success looks like and how success is typically generated, or how do you identify that next high performer on your team? And we both agreed that ambition and purpose are the two things that never fail when you're trying to identify a high performer and then align them to a goal within the organization where they can use that passion in order to create success. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or is that just anecdotal kind of feedback that we kind of put together? But what do you think about ambition and purpose?
I think I agree with you 100%. I think if you have those two essential ingredients, you likely do have a high potential, high performing employee. And
Mhm.
then the trick is, okay, how are we going to keep them there? Right.
Yes.
So then, and so many managers struggle with this
Mhm.
that I know I have a high performing, high potential employee. And boy, oh boy, I don't know what to tell them to keep them going like this. I don't know what I
Yeah.
can do. So it becomes a bit of a responsibility of a leadership team to figure out what a career path looks like for high potential, high performing employees.
Mhm.
And successful companies figure this out. And
They do.
it could be special projects. It
Mhm.
could be being invited to give a presentation for an hour at a leadership retreat.
Mhm.
There are lots of ways that organizations find creative ways to harness that energy and make that employee successful and continue to want to be engaged and continue to want to drive results for the organization. But a lot of organizations don't forward think about this,
They don't.
right? So we've always been big advocates in a performance process of having a 9 box, which measures, traditional 9 box performance and potential. And
Sure.
everybody sees a 9 box, they see it in our product, and they get excited about it. But then they stand back and they say, but there's a problem, John. So, well, what's the problem? They said, well, how do you assess potential?
Mhm.
How do you assess employee potential? Performance and performance management, we can figure out with ratings and scales and how we want to measure this. We get really scientific on that scale called performance. We can look back and be confident that we got the right number. But what about potential?
Mhm.
And so what you end up doing to assess potential, one of the ways you can do it is you ask a series of questions that really get to the heart of DNA.
Mhm.
Does the person have that, right? It's questions like, could they take on more responsibilities within the next year? Would they succeed with that? Are they
Mhm.
interested in that? There's lots of
Mhm.
different behavioral type questions we can ask to try to assess potential. And so why am I saying that? Well, if you were to put a 9 box into this process, it forces a discussion about potential, but then it forces a discussion about how you're going to manage your high potential, high performing
Mhm.
employees, which leads back to what we just said, that you'd have a plan that says, let them do a presentation at a leadership retreat,
Mhm.
let them take on a management of an internal project that they normally wouldn't be able to do. And you
Mhm.
come up with a whole series of different things that we can put our high potentials on a path to continue to engage them.
I agree. And I think far too often, because managers have so much on their plate, right? They're starting to have these development type questions with their people. Maybe it's quarterly, maybe it's semi-annually. And they aren't forward thinking, as you said. They don't know how to keep them um, challenged and moving forward. And the organization itself is not asking for outside help to come in and evaluate these individuals. And so there are so many individuals within organizations today that are deemed average or
Hmm.
meeting expectations that have this burning desire for more,
Hmm.
but there's nobody that's finding them. And particularly with women and people of color, they're less likely to raise their hand and ask for the opportunity. And so you have, I believe, this huge talent pool within your organization that just need to be inspired and really plugged into the right project, like you said, or opportunity that's going to inspire them to want more and do more. So I think we have huge opportunity within our organizations. HR sits at the center of all of this because they
Absolutely.
need one more thing to do during all of this, but they really could lead the organization to this next generation.
Absolutely. 100% agreed. I agree with you 100%. And I think one of our big things is always performance should be about potential, because
Mm,
to your example, too many people get lost in this. And by the way, most HR practitioners I talk to are very pleased when they have a large majority of people that meet expectations and do a great job every day.
Hmm.
And that we should be celebrating those folks, right?
Hmm.
But we also need to give them a path to feel like they can grow in their jobs and in their careers and in their
Hmm.
roles. And that growth doesn't just mean a promotion to the next position.
Right.
That's not the only thing we can offer as an organization. There's lots of diverse experience we can offer to help you grow.
I agree. And there's folks that I talk to, some that I mentor, that I say, take a lateral within the organization.
Sure.
Go hone this other skill that you're going to need for that next promotion, particularly into the executive ranks, because there is a huge divide between manager and executive. And most organizations do not train you to become an executive. They train you to become a better manager. And so a lot of times, about 60% of the time, most fail their first 18 months as an executive because they don't know what the rule book is. They don't know what is expected. They've never been taught or told. And so they have to kind of figure this out. So I encourage a lot of highly talented individuals to take a year or two, take a lateral, go learn a very specific skill that will then propel them forward once they achieve the executive level.
I think that's great advice. I do. I think it's fantastic advice. And that as you move up, there's an expectation that you can do the job, regardless
Yes.
of whether you've had the training. Like that's the one thing.
Right.
Sometimes people don't ask, did you get the what you think is the required training? Well, gee, I
Right.
wish you'd asked. No,
I don't think I was ever asked that question,
I
ever.
don't think you were.
Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
And I work for some fabulous organizations too, who are very focused on performance management. All right. So towards the end of the program, we go through this exercise with our guests called rapid fire questions.
Hmm.
So these are about 5 to 6 quick questions that we ask.
Sure.
What a 1 to 2 sentence answer.
Okay.
And for our listeners, as you listen to these questions and these answers, if you think of any questions that you would like us to ask our next guest, please post them in the comments. Okay. All right. Are you ready for this, John?
Sure.
All right. So the higher you go, the more strategic acumen you need to exhibit. What is the best way for an aspiring CHRO or HR executive to build their strategic acumen muscle?
I would say pick one process in HR and improve it across the board for your entire employee base. Performance management would be a good one to start with.
What is the book or books that you have given as a gift most often?
One Page Talent Management by Mark Efron and Miriam Ort. It aligns to our belief internally here about how to run the best performance management process. It was a bestseller as well. One Page Talent Management.
Okay, One Page Talent Management book.
Yep.
All right. In the last 5 years, what new belief, behavior, or habit has most improved your life?
Taking notes in meetings. And it started at the beginning of COVID because I found I had to because I couldn't remember what the next step was. I was being bombarded by meetings. Taking notes, planning my week
Taking
ahead,
note.
looking at my to-do list, looking at my calendar and my to-do list on a Sunday night or Monday morning for the week to come is really helpful.
So the more chaos, the more planning.
You got it.
What move did you make during your career that had the biggest positive impact?
When I graduated from university, I joined a Fortune 500 company that had the best tools, the best technology tools around business process. And at the time, we used, this is 30 years ago, an automated performance management tool. And I saw the benefits of it, and it's guided my entire career. That the learnings I had in the 3 years there was a consumer goods company.
Who are some people or experts that you follow and why?
I read a lot of Harvard Business Review simply because I find them leading edge in terms of the thought leadership that's there. Experts I follow, I follow Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, and I really love watching their YouTube videos. These two gentlemen in their 90s as to why or why not they would buy Tesla. It's
Mm.
fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating to listen to them. I would encourage your listeners, if you never have, just YouTube Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. Just listen for 10 minutes to them.
That's a whole different podcast too on financial security for employees. So I agree with you. Warren Buffett's terrific. Him and John Bogle. Why should CEOs give HR the credibility that they deserve?
Wow. I mean, they're so impactful, and you said it. I mean, they're the custodians of the biggest asset in the company. It's the biggest expense on every income statement that every organization has. And they're the guiders. They're guiding us through, they're guiding that asset without question. They deserve all the time and attention that a CEO can give.
They do. They do. So as we wrap this up, what tangible next steps can our listeners take back to their businesses tomorrow to get them to start thinking about creating a better performance management system?
So I think small steps lead to big improvements. I think continuous feedback in the form of a quarterly or mid-year check-in is an easy thing to institute. You don't necessarily have to buy a technology layer to do it. It starts with the process and engagement around that process. And I think there's again, I would say check out Adobe's literature, check out the literature on our website around it. There's lots of guides and help out there with you to institute that.
So that's a best practice. Where can people go to learn more about you, Quisitive, or Imperform?
Yeah, the best source is mperform.com. So check us out. It's pretty easy. Mperform is an employee performance, one word, mperform.com.
Fantastic. Thank you, John Smith from Quisitive and Imperform, so much for your time, your talent, and your expertise on this topic. It has been an incredible conversation with you.
Berta, thanks for having me today. This was really a lot of fun. Thank you.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for watching. We would love it if you shared your thoughts on any of the topics we discussed in the comments below. And if you got value from the video, it would mean the world to us if you hit the like button and subscribe to the HRMorning channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Voices of HR.